All right. It is an honor for us to be here with you tonight. And I'm going to start the first part of our presentation. I'm going to be sharing my screen for the presentation. And so here we go. And again, Brad, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And we're going to get started. We have a lot of information to cover tonight. And there are three of us presenting tonight. And so we're going to try to stay true to the time. And so if you see that we are going through some stuff a little quickly, it's on purpose. There is a lot to cover, years and years of history to cover, and different things that are important to cover. And but just know that this is a bird's eye view of what immigration is. And so we're going to be talking first about the history of U.S. immigration policy. So before we get started, the first thing we need to make sure we understand is what an immigrant is. And so an immigrant is a person who who comes to a country to take up permanent residence. So we need to make sure we are understanding that. There are many labels that are put on immigrants. And so like thieves and bad people, rapists, robbers. And so before we can move on, we need to understand that this is the true definition of what an immigrant is. So this first slide that I'm going to show you is just, I want you to really look at this slide and look at the graph. So from the 1820s until the early 2000s, if you look at this graph, it shows us that the majority of immigrants were coming from Europe. So you can see how the majority of the immigrants that were coming into the US were European. And then we see that the next highest number is Americas. So this is America and different. And so we're going to ask that if you are, for you to please mute yourselves. So this is just a quick slide for us to be aware. So the first thing we need to know is that there is immigration where people decide to go into another country. There is also forced immigration, and we're going to talk about that. Today is St. Patrick's Day, and it happens to be a story of forced immigration. St. Patrick was actually taken from his birthplace in Wales and was taken by Irish pirates and taken as a slave back to Ireland. And so this was forced immigration. And there's a whole story about St. Patrick and what he did, and the wonderful work that he later did to show the love of God. But I just wanted to pinpoint and have us pause and notice that there are instances of forced immigration. Another example of forced immigration is that period in time of slavery. African Americans that were brought into this country that were forced to immigrate or migrate from Africa here, that was a forced immigration. They didn't choose to do that. They were trafficked to this country. They didn't have a choice through the transatlantic slave trade. And so we never really take the time to think about that, but slaves or our African American brothers and sisters were part of that. And they were brought and sold in the South, and they were considered property, not human. And so I just want to pause. I know that last week we learned from Dominique Gillard, and he mentioned a little bit about the importance of understanding the history. And this is one thing that is often missed. So I just want us to stop for a second and reflect on that. So we start off with the Constitution of the United States. So in 1787, representatives and direct taxes, this is Article 1, Section 2. Representatives and direct taxes shall be appointed among the several states which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons. So that's what we're going to pay attention to, including those bound to service for a term of years. This is talking about slaves, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. And so this was talking about all other people were not considered full humans. Indians were completely excluded, and we heard about that a little bit with Lenore Stars when she came to talk to us. So I just want us to kind of situate ourselves in the Constitution, where this kind of began to set into trajectory what we now know as immigration. So the U.S. Constitution, we were when let me go back to the slide. So when we were when this was brought to fruition, we were not people of color, and women were not part of what these laws were meant for. So it's important for us to understand that. Later on, we go to the Naturalization Act of 1790. And so this is an act that furthermore kind of brought this to light. It restricted naturalization to free white persons. And these naturalization restrictions by race were not completely removed until 1952. So really important for us to understand that this type of freedom was really only guaranteed to free white persons. So this act reveals one of the deepest ambiguities in American citizenship in requiring a period of residence prior to naturalization. Members of Congress emphasized that foreigners should spend sufficient time in the United States to appreciate American democracy. Congress viewed America as a school for equality and democracy, but by preventing foreign-born people of color from becoming citizens, the act established that American citizenship contained its own aristocracy, that of race. And this is something that we often don't even realize is part of our laws. So we continue to move on, and then we are encountered with the Civil War, the Emancipation, and so now we see the 14th Amendment is radically transforming the possibilities of inclusion for citizenship in the US. And this was because they needed slaves to then be part of the Civil War. They fought in the war. And so the adoption of the 14th Amendment in 1868 stated that anyone born in the US would automatically become a US citizen. So finally, we're seeing a promise that unfortunately would be broken. The Naturalization Act of 1790 limited naturalization to free white persons. Naturalization was extended to people of African descent in 1870, but not to Asians. And we're going to talk about that in specifically in just a little bit. And so this was the idea that there was naturalization extended to them, but there were issues with that. So we're going to learn a little bit about the Asian wave of immigration. And so we see that in 1848, there was the gold rush, and there was a huge wave of immigration coming in through the West. And there were huge numbers of people coming to California specifically. And then there was a need or a desire to expand the Industrial Revolution by creating railroads. So most of the workers that were working on the railroads were Chinese. Then the US enters an economic and fiscal crisis in the late 19th century, so anti-Asian sentiment begins to rise. So what we're seeing right now in the news with anti-Asian sentiment, it's not new. It's something that has been in the history of this country for centuries. So the Page Act of 1875 was the first restrictive federal immigration law in the US, which effectively prohibited the entry of Chinese women, marking the end of the open borders. The 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act would go on to ban immigration by Chinese men as well. And the sponsor of the law introduced it as a way to end the danger of cheap Chinese labor and immoral Chinese women. So even in our laws, there was racist language that would create a sense of fear towards people. Then in 1882, Chinese Exclusion Act was a United States federal law prohibiting all immigration of Chinese laborers. Building on the 1875 Page Act, the Chinese Exclusion Act was the first and remains the only law to have been implemented to prevent all members of a specific ethnic or national group from immigrating to the United States. So here we see that there were that this was very specific to the Chinese. Then we see another wave of immigrants, and this was on the East Coast. So if you recognize this, this is Ellis Island. It served as the nation's major immigration station here in the United States from 1892 to 1954. During that period, an estimated 12 million immigrants passed through Ellis Island, where they were processed by immigration authorities and obtained permission to enter the United States. Now, think about this. Most of the people that came through Ellis Island were from European countries, so there's a huge discrepancy there. The top 3 countries of origin were Ireland, Italy, and Germany, and only 2% of people that came in through Ellis Island during that whole time were turned away. So you can see the disparity there. Then in 1924, the Immigration Act of 1924 restricted immigration overall, introducing a quota system. Now, the quota system was what began to limit the number of immigrants coming from any single nation. This is where we begin to see radical changes and radical problems. Western and Northern European were favored in these quotas, and immigration dropped from nearly 707,000 in 1924 to roughly 294,000 in 1925. So we see that the quota system really did a huge drastic change in immigration. So then we see a surge of immigrants in the West again. And so I'm not going chronologically, I'm going according to the waves that we see. And here we see these are Mexican workers that were coming into the United States to work on the fields, a lot of migrant workers, and to work on the railroads as well. And so the first thing we need to know is that in 1848, so this is happening simultaneously as when the gold rush was happening, the Treaty of Guadalupe was signed. It was a treaty between Mexico and the US that ceded states like Arizona, California, and New Mexico, and it extended citizens to Mexicans living in the newly annexed territory. Former Mexican citizens were allowed to keep, quote unquote, their land. And that isn't necessarily what happened. Here we saw that they were promised many things and those things didn't happen. So there wasn't a border, so to speak, because there was this treaty that occurred. And as we've seen in history, the treaty was not, the US didn't keep their promises with that treaty. So in 1929, we see the Mexican Repatriation Act begin. The Mexican Repatriation Act was a mass deportation of Mexicans and Mexican Americans between 1929 and 1936. In California alone, approximately 400,000 American citizens and legal residents of Mexican ancestry were forced to go to Mexico. These were legal residents that were born in the United States, and they were all lumped together just because they had a Mexican surname or Spanish surname, and they were forced to leave this country and go to Mexico. A total of 2 million people were forced to go to Mexico, 1.2 million of whom had been born in the US and were really should have been protected by the 14th Amendment. Many people lost their homes and their businesses and all of their personal property. When they left and they were forced to leave, all of their things were taken by other people. So the Bracero program in 1942, and this one is near and dear to my heart. The program brought more than 400,000 Mexican citizens, seasonal workers to the US during peak years in the late 1950s. So you see that there's a push and pull with immigration. When there is a need in the US for workers, they bring people to come and work, or they open the borders, or they say, come and work. The Bracero program is an example of that. And it ended in 1964 amid opposition from labor unions. And the reason why I said that it's near and dear to my heart is that my grandfather was a bracero, and so he came from Mexico to work during that time in the 40s, and he stayed for a long time, and it was a devastating time for him when he was and you'll see what happens. So the bracero program, you know, a lot of people coming, working, everybody's happy. But then what happens in 1954, Operation Wetback comes into play, a vigorous federally led effort to move undocumented Mexican immigrants from the Southwest. The term wetback is a disparaging term applied to Mexicans who presumably swam across the Rio Grande River and today is considered an ethnic slur. The Eisenhower administration deported about 1.3 million people. A lot of them, again, were citizens of the United States. And among one of those people was my grandfather, similar to the Repatriation Act in 1930 that authorized mass deportations. So many people were devastated by both the Repatriation Act and Operation Wetback. And I'm running out of time, so I'm going to move along and go quicker. 1952, the Mccarran Walter Act. This act retained the quota system from the Immigration Act of 1924 and gave preference to certain countries like Great Britain, Germany, and Ireland, while reducing the number of immigrants from the colonies in the New World. So I hope you're beginning to see a pattern here. In banned racial and ethnic discrimination over who can naturalize, allowing Asians to naturalize, it broke down the Asiatic barred zone. It was a step in the right direction. However, it only allocated 100 visas to each Asian nation. 100. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, it abolished the quota system, which limited immigration from individual nations and gave preference to certain European countries. The act moved to a system based on family unity and worker skills. So you can begin to see that there is a lot of legislation now. The Immigration Reform and Control Act, known as 1986 Amnesty, this gave citizenship to nearly 3 million undocumented immigrants. And this is when we now have the law that it was made that it was a crime to knowingly hire an undocumented worker. Then, this is probably the worst thing that has ever happened to immigration history. Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996, the law instituted a 10-year ban for entering the country illegally and staying for more than 1 year. And this is where we begin to see a lot of the atrocities that we see now. It started from here. Then the creation of Homeland Security in 2002 in response to the 9/11 terrorist attacks. The U.S. Realigned its immigration agencies, placing all agencies under the new department called Homeland Security. In the decade following 9/11, border security and deportations increased dramatically. And this is where we began to see a rise in anti-Muslim terror and attack in response to this, just like we saw the attack on during the time of the Asian Exclusion Act. There were a lot of things that were done that were that many people don't even know about, but that were very disheartening and very hard for families, especially Muslim families, and just as we saw with the Repatriation Act and the other acts that we've seen very briefly. Then there was an executive order during President Barack Obama's time, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals in 2012. He used his executive authority to temporary deportation relief for young undocumented immigrants. It allowed them to go to school and to work. And so we see that a lot of these Daca recipients, they came unknowing. It wasn't them coming into this country because they wanted to. They were the children of immigrants, and so they essentially this essentially was something that needed to be granted. Then we see in May 7th, 2018, the DOJ implemented a zero tolerance policy. And I think this is one of the most crushing things that we've seen to detour border entry at the southern border and that's our border. For those of us that are here in California, it criminally prosecuted adults for illegally crossing the border and punished them by detaining them in a federal facility. And we learned about this last week with Dominique Gillard as he was talking about how the criminalization of immigrants has now become, it's become rampant. And this is where children were then separated from their families. Children were sent to a detention center separately if parents cannot be released with them. Children are treated as unaccompanied alien children and transferred to the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Refugee Resettlement for care and custody. According to the Congressional Research Service, about 3,000 children were separated and thousands more after the announcement of the policy change. And this is probably one of the most gut-wrenching things that we have seen within this administration. So now we are going to enter into a biblical response.
Thank you, Juana. That was great. You did that actually in 15 minutes. That was awesome. So a biblical response, sometimes we hear people take their cues from the political party, but as Christians, we should always be guided by what the Bible says, and let the Bible form and shape our theology around certain topics. So if we just breeze on through, and this is a 30,000 view of immigration throughout the Bible. So Leviticus 19:34, the foreigner, and you're going to see some. I'm going to make note of some Hebrew words because the Bible talks about the foreigner, the sojourner, the stranger, and according to different biblical versions, those terms get misinterpreted. So we're actually going to focus on the actual Hebrew words. So the foreigner, the gar, residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself. For you were foreigners, you were gar in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Leviticus 19:34. Deuteronomy 10:18. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow, and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. So first of all, throughout the Bible, any living being, any human being is made in the image of God. Genesis 1:27. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So all humankind have been made in the image of God. So the Missio Dei is the mission of God. God is sending the church to the world. We see that in the Great Commission, Matthew 28:19. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He is sending the church to the world. Through what's going on with globalization and markets just transferring back and forth into different countries, we see people coming to our nation, and how convenient. God is sending us to the world, and the world is coming to us. So the Visio Dei, Revelations chapter 7:9. So this is what should be central to all Christians. So we know that we are made in the image of God. We know what our mission is, but this is the vision, ultimate vision of God. After this I looked, and therefore before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. They were wearing white robes and were holding palm branches in their hands. So every nation, every tribe, every people, and every language standing before the throne and worshiping our God. So it is important for us to look at some definitions of some terms in the Old Testament. So first of all, the natives, the Izrah. This is a word that can be translated as homeborn. These are people that are that were born from the 12 tribes. The Hebrew word is for native is like I said, Erskra. And this word comes from the verbal root of Zorar, which means to come up or come out of. So in this passage in Numbers 15:13, all that are homeborn shall do these things after this manner, in offering an offering made by fire of sweet savor unto Jehovah. So homeborn were born from these 12 tribes, and they had a specific law, which was the Torah. So the immigrant, um, it, it is um, it is confusing, and most people miss it because immigrant, foreigner, sojourner, they're all mixed up. But if we look a little bit deeper in the Hebrew words, immigrant is actually the word ger, and it is derived from the verb ger, which means to dwell with or to dwell among. So an immigrant is one who is not a native-born Israelite, but lives with the natives, native to the Israelites. According to the Torah, the immigrants are to live according to the same customs and laws as natives. One law should be to him that is homeborn, and unto the strangers, the ger, the sojourner among you. So these are people that are foreigners, but that decide to live within the Israelites. And so they have to um, acculturate themselves to Hebrew customs and to adopt the Torah. And so then there's the foreigner, which is a Nakri. And a foreigner is one who was born in foreign land, but unlike an immigrant, they are not bound to the customs of the law of the natives or immigrants, and almost all the time did not live within the Hebrew people. Most foreigners came from the hostile nations or were people that practiced pagan rituals. So you see the difference in the different words, and I think that is important because the Bible says a lot about the ger and uses the ger almost 92 times, and uh, and has specific practices that the Hebrews had to do with the ger. And but the foreigner was somebody that lived mostly all the time outside of the Israelites. So what was their responsibility for the ger? Um, so first of all, Israel was commanded to show hospitality to all travelers, sojourners, foreigners, either the ger or the natri. They were to show hospitality to everyone, just like Abraham did with the celestial beings. He didn't know who they were. They were just travelers, but they had to show hospitality to everyone. But the ger in particular, they were to treat them as your own, as native born. They were even allowed to participate in their feast, also even participate in the Passover meal. So can you imagine? God was already revealing His ultimate plan that is revealed in the New Testament to reach and to extend His plan of salvation to even to the foreigners beyond Israel. They were supposed to be incorporated into all aspects of Hebrew life. The poor immigrants, which were the ger, would be allowed to glean the fields. So there was a system of provision. Give them food and clothing, love them, like Deuteronomy 10:19 says. And they are supposed to be equal to the native born. The treatment should be the same in the court systems. They got to have a Sabbath. The Israelites encouraged to practice hospitality to all strangers, again, either to the foreigner, the traveler, the permanent resident. And in Matthew 25, he uses a Greek word, which is xenos, which we'll talk in a little bit. So Abraham was an immigrant because he leaves his hometown or home city of Ur to migrate into Canaan. Then he flees into Egypt because of the famine. So Abraham lies to get into and remain safe in Egypt, and this just goes to show that uh, some reasons why people migrate to different places And here we see a case of economic immigration. Abraham fleeing into Egypt, and then having to what lie? The father of our faith. Well, it was a half line that you can look up. Joseph, Joseph, as Juana was explaining, the involuntary immigrant was an involuntary immigrant because he was enslaved and was forced to migrate to Egypt as a slave. But God had a purpose for his life. As an immigrant, he was falsely accused, which happens a lot, believe it or not. We were doing our one of our thesis projects for our undergrad work in the Monument Corridor in Concord, California, and there was several sites there where they had migrant workers, and we interviewed like 50 of them, and story after story, they would just tell us how they were taken advantage of. People would contract them, had them work for a whole week, and never paid them. Some even were abused. I mean, it was just horrible stories, one story after another. He became a resident of Egypt, but then following his generation, his people experienced violence and enslavement. And Israel was there for 400 years. So the nation of Israel, they were foreigners in Egypt for 400 years. They were also exiled into Babylon for 70 years. Ruth is another example of an immigrant. Ruth was an immigrant from a hostile nation. She calls herself the Anakiri, or a foreigner, not a ger, a Nakiri, because she came from a nation that was hostile to the Hebrews, but finds grace, um, and is one of the three women that are found in the lineage of Jesus Christ. A foreigner in the lineage of Jesus Christ, yes. And her statement, "Do not urge me to leave you or to turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." This is a cry to become a ger rather than a nakri. This was her naturalization ceremony statement. Daniel and his friends were forced to migrate to Babylon. The practice of the Babylonians were to take the youngest and the strongest and the smartest and reprogram them, reteach them, and culturate them, educate them into Babylonian culture and education system. Um, and they were there for 70 years. So these Hebrews struggled to keep their culture and beliefs, but as you see at the end, they were faithful to their God. So this just goes to show how the struggles that immigrants encounter as they migrate to another country, especially if it's a forced migration. We kind of compare this to the Daca students that are or kids that were brought here, not a choice of their own, but they're here and they're acculturated with the U.S. culture and language. And some Daca students don't even know how to speak their parents' language, and but they're in limbo because they have no pathway for citizenship. They're just in limbo. So all of this, all these examples in the Bible about immigration and how we should treat the immigrants as one of our own, and but then there's this Romans chapter 13 that a lot of people cite, and it's I'm not going to read it all, but it's basically let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except that which is God that has established. So this is something that is cited a lot. What about our laws? What about our laws around immigrants? Shouldn't we obey those? And shouldn't the immigrants that come to this country do it the right way? Well, if we look at that one ordinance, just the zero tolerance law, I mean that is plain obvious that is an unjust law. I think as Christians and as people that live in a democracy, we are allowed to challenge the laws, and we could overturn laws if we advocate uh, um, for immigrants when they are being unjustly um, um, treated. Uh, like MLK, in response to unjust laws, says, one may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer lies in fact that there are two types of laws, just and unjust. I would be first to advocate obeying just laws. One has only one, a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. Now that is the difference between the two. How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. And an unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in the eternal law or natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that disregards human personality is unjust. So basically, what MLK was saying between just and unjust laws is that there's four laws. There's a natural law, an eternal law, divine law, and all these laws basically have to be in harmony in order for it to be a just law. The natural law is basic human rights, the right to be free, the right to feed your family, uh, the right to be human. So becomes, when that is taken away, um, then everything else that hinders that is unjust. When everything is in harmony, that's a just law, and those are the laws that we should support. There has been unjust laws, friends, throughout our history, as Juana has mentioned. All these exclusion acts, downright racist laws that have a racist name in their law. Um, so we as Christians, we not only have an obligation to take in the stranger, but to advocate for these laws to be overturned. So in Matthew chapter 25, it's actually verse 38 through 40. It says, "When did we see you a stranger?" And this is a Greek word now, the xenos, and this is where we get the word xenophobia, which is a fear of stranger, and invite you in, or needing clothes or clothe you. When did we see you sick or in prison or go to visit you? The king will reply, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it for me. So that is our biblical response. We are to take in the stranger, the foreigner, the foreigner that wants to live within us. Now, I know it's complicated, and Juana's going to talk about the complications. Do we just open up the borders and let everybody in? I know it's complicated, but we'll talk about that in a second.
All right. So, so here are some complexities that we're gonna, and we don't have answers, right? Tonight we are learning, and we are learning really what the history is, and learning how we need to be responding as Christians. That's really what we're doing here. We don't have the answers. We don't necessarily have the ability to change policy. We can help in that, but it doesn't fall on us. We can advocate for that. So here are some complexities, right? There are over 643,000 DACA recipients. There are backlogs. For example, 22 years to immigrate a Mexican son or daughter of a U.S. citizen. These are some complexities, and Diane, who I will be presenting in just a few minutes, is going to talk about that in a lot more detail. Undocumented parents that have a U.S. citizen child, DAPA, got held up in the courts. So there's policy that got stuck in the courts to help with that. Refugees filing for asylum, asylees are treated like criminals, and we learned about that last week. Children have been separated from their families and still have not been reunited. These are some complexities, but these are some really hard realities that have happened in this country under our watch. And this is supposed to be a Christian nation. And so here are some things that we need to be aware of. These are some things that we need to be, on the forefront of advocating for, because these are things that are unjust. So I have a quote that I'm going to read, and then I'm going to tell you a quick story before I present Diane. It says, in my life, the stories I have heard from my family, my friends, my community, and from willing strangers all over the world have been the true source of my education. And this is Holly Neer. I'm going to stop sharing. So I work as a co-pastor, but for over 20 years, I've worked as a teacher in a community of about 68% Latinos. And so in the time that I have been working there, I've met many, many amazing people. Many, because I speak the language, there have been families and moms specifically that have come to me, that have talked to me, and that have shared their stories and have cried with me, and I have cried with them and prayed with them. And there are a couple of stories that have been very impactful. There are stories, obviously, in our own family of immigration that have been tragic, but there's one story of a mom who I'm going to call Maria. And she shared a story about how when she was coming to the US, she came and she didn't tell me all of the details about how she came, but she said that she was trying to do things the right way, and that she went to find a notary. And so she went and found a lawyer. She found a notario, a notary here in the US. When you find a notary, we know that these are people that can help fill out paperwork and be able to, you use them to be able to sign official documents. In Mexico, a notario is often a lawyer. And so she assumed that it was a lawyer that she was going to. This was many years ago. And so she went to them, and there were many people there. So she thought, okay, well, all these people are here. They all had the same story. They were taking in their paperwork. They're trying to get their legal citizenship and, trying to go through the process. She turned in all of her paperwork and left them $8,000. This was about 9 years ago. And they said, don't call us, we'll call you. This is a long process. Here's what you need to do. And a month went by, she hadn't heard from them. 2 months went by, still hadn't heard from them. She finally goes to look for them because nobody's answering. And they had closed up shop, moved out, and there was nobody there, nobody to answer. Her paperwork was gone. Her money was gone. And so she was taken advantage of by people here that were pretending to be lawyers, that were pretending to help, and left this woman in dire need and just a horrible, horrible situation. This happens more often than we could even begin to imagine. And this is part of the process. This is part of the story of so many immigrants in this country. And it's just tragic. So I hate to leave you with a story like that, but I think it's important for us to understand that it's not just about policy. These are real people that suffer these things. And this is a reality for so many of our neighbors that we as Christians are called to love. And so it is my great privilege to welcome not just an expert in the field, but a friend. And I'm going to read a short blurb and then I'm going to turn it over. In 2005, Diane Martinez moved to Santa Barbara into the West Side neighborhood. She soon realized that she was living among many immigrant neighbors who spoke mainly Spanish. Diane felt out of place and wanted to move someplace else where she would feel more comfortable, but her family's circumstances did not allow this to happen. In asking God why she was in this neighborhood, he started to show her his heart for the immigrant. Over 7 years of studying the Bible and working with many immigrant families, she came to know and love the families she had the honor to serve. God gave her his heart for the immigrant. In 2011, the Lord provided Shoreline Community Church with a vision to love our neighbors by providing immigration services. Immigrant Hope Santa Barbara opened its doors in 2012, providing English and civics classes for adults who wanted to naturalize to become US citizens, and in 2014 received recognition from the Department of Justice to provide legal representations to immigrants putting in applications with US citizenship and immigration services. God has been faithful in growing this ministry year after year, allowing this ministry to increase the number of people served, the types of applications we can complete, and the education classes they provide. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Diane Martinez.
Unmute. Okay. Hello, everybody. Juana, thank you for inviting me in, and look forward to sharing with you today.
And I'm going to share my screen.
All right. So Juana and Phil had asked me to speak about what's happening in immigration today. There's been so many changes to immigration just in these last few months since President Biden has come into office. But first, I just want to give you a little introduction of what the U.S. looks like. So the U.S. actually has the largest population of immigrants in any other country, with an estimation of over 47 million immigrants. About 10.5 million, and people say anywhere from 10.5 to 12 million are unauthorized immigrants. And there are about 25 million immigrants that have actually naturalized, so are naturalized citizens now. We have 12.3 million lawful permanent residents and about 2.2 million temporary lawful residents. More than 60% of the unauthorized immigrants have lived in the country for over 10 years, and they have combined between them over 4 million US citizen children born to them here in the United States, and they make up about 5% of our workforce. Interesting enough, about close to half of the unauthorized immigrants that we have in the United States did not enter unauthorized through border crossings, but they actually arrived as US students on work visas, or came as tourists into the United States. So they came into our country legally. You can change it, Juana, to the next. I'm going to go over this, but when talking about undocumented, we often hear people say, why don't they just do it the right way? However, for so many of them, there is not a right way. They would love to be able to have an application process to be able to go through. But because of, as Juana had gone through all of those laws, it's obvious with the change of laws that there are many barriers that stop people from being able to put in an immigration application. What you're looking at here is you're looking at a visa bulletin. And what happens is there about 70% of the applications that are approved in the United States are approved through family visas. To qualify for a family visa, you have to be a parent, a child, a spouse, or a brother or sister of a US citizen or a legal permanent resident. But I want you to look, we're gonna look at these categories, and you're gonna look at Mexico. And you can see from this line that right now, these are the applications dates. This is telling you the dates that they're working on. So for an F1 category, for example, they're working on February 22nd, 1998. And so you're going to see all of these are in the 90s. And so that means that if somebody put in an application in 2000, that they still have a couple of years to wait before they're even going to get their visa approved, that they can finish the process to become a legal permanent resident. And so the wait times, as Juana had stated, is just astronomical, especially for Mexico and Philippines. So F4s, when you're looking down, there are a brother and a sister. And so we have many brothers and sisters that have applied for each other within the United States and out of the United States, but just are just waiting for those applications or for the visas to be approved. The United States only approves 226,000 visa applications a year, but what happens is that 2 to 3 times that many applications are received. So every year it just backlogs, and we haven't seen these numbers move in a while. So when I first started in 2012, there was like a 10 to 12 year wait, but you can see that they just keep getting farther and farther back in their approval times. All right, I wanted to go over some of the actions. Juana, can you go to the next slide? So there have been hundreds of executive actions that have already been signed in these last few months. There's no way we can go over all of them. I'm going to hit some of them pretty quickly so we can get through some of them, but we talked a little bit about the border wall. And so that has been a kind of a big topic for the last 4 years, but President Biden signed a executive order which actually paused the building of the border wall until they could determine what other types of strategies they could use to control the border. So for right now, that is on hold. Interior enforcement priorities right now. Many people have probably heard the word ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. They had been doing a lot of picking up of individuals and deporting individuals within the United States. But currently the administration has asked them to hold off on those. ICE is picking up people, but who they're mostly concentrating on are people with criminal issues in their past, and so those are what they're doing. ICE isn't necessarily always following this, and so there are sometimes other people that are in the situations with them that are also getting taken and put into detention centers or being deported. Entry bans. So the entry bans, there was 4 orders by the Trump administration that did not allow mostly people from Muslim countries to come into the United States. So a proclamation was signed by President Biden to no longer deny entry from those countries just based off of the country that they're from. So they have to look at other things in deciding whether or not to let them in. Temporary protective status. Temporary protective status is actually allows people like provisional humanitarian protection from their home country because the home country has gone through something like an armed conflict, they're gone through a natural disaster, or they're dealing with some kind of epidemic, and it has been determined that it is not safe for them to return to their home country. So recently, there has been a designation for, I think it's about close to 200,000 Venezuelans who are living in the United States right now, who last week it was opened up for them to be able to apply for temporary protective status. So that gives them protection from deportation, and it also gives them a work permit that allows them to work while they're here. And then a date will be set, and it will be reviewed to determine when they would have to be returned home. Unfortunately, with temporary protective status, once it's determined that they're safe to go home, it doesn't really open them up. It's similar to Daca, where it's only temporary residency, and it doesn't right now have any type of pathway to legal permanent residency and citizenship. But that's a change that's coming up too. So we'll talk about that in a minute. Public charge. So the public charge rule says that that if somebody applies for someone this is going to apply to family visas only. When somebody applies for a relative, they determine whether or not they're likely to become a public charge, meaning whether they're likely to become use public benefits. There was very few that this applied to prior to the Trump administration, but when President Trump came in last year, he changed it, and it was really a test that if the person had little or no income, it was a way to keep them out. They called it a wealth test to keep them out. But what happened instead is it stopped many people from getting from using benefits, even like Medicaid or Medi-Cal for their U.S. citizen children. And so this has now been halted, and public charge has gone back just for looking at people as they're entering the United States to determine whether or not somebody makes enough income to sponsor them and allow them into the United States based off of the requirements set by the U.S. Citizen and Immigration Services. All right, at the border. This was talked a little bit about, but last month alone, 9,000 minors came to the border without their parents, and was put under the was taken in by U.S. Customs and Border Patrol. So what happens is that when they come without a parent, then Customs and Border Patrol is called CBP. So they're placed in a CBP facility that's really not designed to hold the children. They're only supposed to be there 72 hours, and then they're supposed to be turned over to the custody of Human and Health Services. However, that hasn't been happening as fast with Human and Health Services, and they have something like 13,000 places in shelters for children. But however, with COVID requirements, that has gone down to 8,000, and it's currently thought that there is about 8,200 children that are in their custody right now. So they're not able to meet the requirements set up based off of COVID. This is actually gotten Biden into a little bit of trouble because it's considered overcrowding and unsafe practices. So they're looking at ways other ways to house these children. Normally, they're only supposed to be in Health and Human Services custody for about 2 weeks, and then they move. They try to find a relative in the United States that they can place the children with. However, right now, instead of just being there for a few weeks, it's taking on the average of a few months to be able to get all that done and to transfer the children into the custody of the U.S. relative. And then asylum seekers. With asylum seekers, asylum seekers are those that come to the United States. They come to the borders because they are fear of their life. They've been persecuted for one of 5 reasons, which is based off race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or member of a certain political group. And so they come seeking asylum. And we know that many of them have been turned away because there was a Remain in Mexico program. Now that they've lifted that up, there's many that are coming and seeking to come into the United States. However, a small amount are getting in each month. And so a new bill has been passed that would provide funding for asylum and determine a process on how they're going to handle them outside of the United States. And then for those that do come into the United States, the bill is going to be hiring additional immigration judges and asylum processing personnel to try to get these asylum cases approved or denied in some cases, to determine whether they can stay in the United States. Right now, the backlog on them, it's taking years to get an approval for us, an asylum case. Refugee resettlement, there is also an executive action on that. And so refugees are people that are outside of the United States who are unable to return to their countries, also because of the same reasons as the asylum seeker, because of one of the 5 reasons that we gave. And so in 2020, only 11,814 refugees were resettled in the United States. It's the lowest number of refugees that have been allowed in the United States since the passing of the Refugee Act of 1980. This last year, the US cap was 15,000, but starting October 1st, 2021, Biden pledges to increase the cap to 125,000. At our highest before, it was around 80,000 people. So in the next year, then that is what we're looking for. And there are countries that get approved for these refugee resettlements. And then border control and safety measures. So they are looking at ways besides the wall to control the border. So they're looking at cameras, they're looking at different kinds of electronic equipment. They're looking at ways to patrol the borders in between entry sites. And so we'll see what they come up with. But for right now, the idea is to pause the building of the wall and for CBP to come up with a plan to try to control the borders, mostly along the lines of trying to help keep narcotics out of the United States. All right, for Daca, there's an executive action on Daca as well, to preserve and fortify deferred action for childhood arrivals memorandum. So in 2012, as Juana had stated, Daca came about and it allowed people that had been into the United States that came before 2007 and were here in July of 2012 when the act went into place, to apply for a work authorization and temporary status. And so it was halted up until December, and in December it opened back up, and we're now seeing new applicants again, as well as renewal applicants. The other thing it did, which had been halted since 2017, is it allows parole in place, which allows someone to leave the country. If they already have Daca, they can apply to leave the country for three purposes. If they have a family member who's passed away or is about to pass away, or if they need to go for school or work, or for some kind of humanitarian reasons. People have even got it for doing like mission trips to another place, or to go help when Mexico had an earthquake and to clean up. So they can be granted that. The nice thing about that is if they're granted parole in place, they get to come back into the United States, admitted into the United States, and then they're considered here legally, and then that opens up other processes for them. And then in the Citizenship Act, which we're going to talk about real quick next, Daca actually has a direct path for residency and citizenship included in that act. All right. And so this is the proposal. It is a huge act. If you read the whole act, it's about 84 pages long. We're just going to talk about a few things. But we talked about create an earned roadmap to citizenship for undocumented individuals. The hope is it's going to open up for many undocumented individuals. So we talked about Daca. It's also going to provide a pathway for temporary protective status. So those from Venezuela and these other countries that already are here on temporary protective status would have a quicker pathway to citizenship. For those that are here undocumented right now, it would allow them to apply first for a temporary residency. They would have to be background checked. They would not allow certain criminal activities in the application process. So some people would be vetted out because of criminal activity. But it would give them a beginning pathway where they'd be temporary for 2 years, and they could apply for a green card, and then they could apply for citizenship. For these people to be able to apply for citizenship, though, they have to learn English, and they have to learn our civics and government test as well. And they want to put in a provision about them making sure all the way through this process that they've been paying their taxes. And so those are some of the requirements that are going to be there. The idea is to keep families together. And so right now, as we talked about when we were looking at that screen with the waiting times for applications, they hope to get through some of that and be able to open up more visas that are going to allow these families to be together. Some of these families have applied within the United States. Some of them have applied outside of the United States and have been waiting a long time to be able to be together and see each other. They're going to promote immigration and refugee integration and citizenship. So right now they would be working on allowing refugee integration from these countries and make that a pathway to citizenship as well. Improve the immigration court systems. Right now, the courts are overwhelmed. It's as we had talked before, they're looking at putting more immigration judges in, but they're looking at training them, especially more in the asylee process, and allow them more discretion on whether or not people should stay if they meet the requirements to stay. Right now, many people have met those requirements, but they were really they were being overturned even though they had met the asylee requirements. And so now they're going to go back and train the judges to make sure that if people meet those requirements, that they're not being returned to countries that they could be persecuted in and in some cases killed. So And then again, we talked about support asylum seekers and other vulnerable populations that would then allow them as well. So what I love, this is the part I love to talk about, you know, when God opened up the door to do Immigrant Hope, many people were like, why are you doing an immigration program? But it was obvious to us that God was not having us do an immigration program. Immigration was just the door opener of service that allowed people to walk into our center that would probably, many of them would never walk into our churches, but they get to walk into to our centers, and we get to tell them the truth. Many of them don't have a pathway, as we talked about right now. Many of them, we have to say, no, there is no open pathway to you. And even if there is, I did this comparison just to show you guys the difference and the door opener that God gives us to share his acceptance of the foreigner. And so you can see with US citizen, I mean, the process is a long time from start to finish, anywhere from 5 to a 20-year process. But in eternal citizenship, it's immediately upon inviting Christ into our lives. There's a high cost for many. I mean, we're talking about thousands and thousands of dollars for just the USCIS process. And in this case, Juana told you about a friend of hers for just this one starting process left them $8,000. And we hear about that. I mean, $8,000 to $20,000 for these processes. But Jesus paid the cost for all of us. And so there is no cost for eternal citizenship except just to say yes. The barriers make people ineligible. So if there's any kind of criminal issue in the past, Juana talked about the bans, the 10-year bans that don't allow, because they left and came back, it bans them from getting residency and then citizenship. So there's no forgiveness in the law right now, but God gave us complete forgiveness because he took it all. And so past sins are not a barrier for eternal citizenship. And then there are certain cases that citizenship can be revoked, but never with the Lord. I mean, if you truly turn yourself over to the Lord, it's eternal and forever. And Phil talked a little bit about this, but it's just a picture that the Lord had given me in serving immigrants. Romans 13 always comes up. And yet we do have to look at fair and just laws. And we've talked a lot about, is that really the case? Is that what we're looking at right now? Or do we need a immigration reform that is truly going to be just and fair, not only in our eyes, but according to the Lord? And we're going to look at, there's so many verses here. These are just the beginning of them. And so you see, this may be a little part of the conversation, but we can't forget this part of the conversation on how the Lord feels about the immigrant, and the story of the Good Samaritan, and Matthew 25, where he says, you serving the least of these, let alone him telling us all throughout the Old Testament that the foreigner was to be treated the same. And so so this is just something that in my heart, I just wanted to share with you and say that God is so faithful. And when we pour ourselves into reading his word, and you understand his heart for the immigrant, then we understand that and look at the US immigration laws, we have to say, okay, something's not right here. Something needs to change. We have people that want to be a part of this United States, and yet we put the barriers up for them.